This week on Inside the Issues, we speak with Emanuel Adler on the structure of global order. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast from the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm David Welch, I'm your host, and I am the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week we talk to a notable expert on some issue of importance to global governance. And this week I'm very happy to welcome Emanuel Adler, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and also the Andrea and Charles Bronfman Chair in Israeli Studies. Not least importantly, also co-editor of the journal International Organization, one of the premier journals of international affairs. Welcome, Emanuel.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here with us today. And we talk in this series with a lot of people who have very detailed knowledge of specific issues and issue areas. We don't very often have an opportunity to step back and talk to people who have a very interesting and very detailed grasp of the big issues. So today I'm very happy to be having an opportunity to chat about some of the deeper questions of global order and how they relate to global governance.
Take me there, I'll see
you there. So we talk about globalization a lot, and we all think of the modern world as globalized, and that brings to mind an image of a world that's very tightly interconnected in all respects and in all places. And a lot of people would argue that that's not true. And I know that's your view in particular, that that's not true. The world is only globalized in certain ways. But at certain very fundamental ideational levels and identity levels, it's not. What's your view on that, and how, if at all, has that been changing recently?
Well, actually, you portrayed my view quite right. On the one hand, the globalization image helps understand or to portray the notion that in spite of all these differences, the ones you were talking about, there is a process by which societies and the practices of government are becoming more similar across divides. But at the same time, it is very different to see the same type of issues, let's say if we are talking about democracy or the environment or human rights, let's say from Waterloo, Canada, than from Cairo, Egypt. And the meanings are different, and they are different because, first of all, around the world we are 6+ or perhaps now 7 billion people that are more or less part of one civilization of modernity, but with multiple types of modernity. And these multiple types of modernity lead us to not only different ways of interpreting the stuff of globalization, but acting differently. And so we differ in practices. We have different practices. Some have more liberal practices than others. In two different places of the world, the two peoples may call themselves democratic, but they are talking about different things. They are not really talking about the same thing. And so I think that what we are seeing now is a world that is on one hand becoming more alike, sometimes in prosaic things of sort of the kinds of sort of McDonald's of the world and things like that, of sort of these indicators that you can find the same types of products or things like that around the world, but we are very much divided by these different types of modernities that actually have not converged. And if at all, they may be even diverging in some places, which in extreme led people like the late Sam Huntington to argue of a clash of civilizations. But even if we don't go to that extreme, which I don't buy, is really fractures at the levels of identity, fractures at the levels of practices, sometimes fractures at the levels of practices within one civilization, if I may say so. Let's say Western civilization, where the Americans, for example, and the Europeans may want the same thing, basically, let's say about terrorism, but they have different ways of going about it, right. That is, of acting, and most of the discussion last decade between Americans and Europeans was about that. What do we do about it? Not whether, they share the same values, which more or less they do.
And is your understanding of different modernities basically geographical? In other words, there's a European modernity and there's an American modernity? Or would you find two different modernities in Europe and the same two different modernities in the United States? How would you relate those?
That is contested. The concept of multiple modernities goes back to Shmuel Eisenstadt, who recently died, a very famous sociologist. And he started actually with an analysis of what he called axial age civilizations that go back to the 6th century BC, which is really sort of those civilizations that developed core cultures mainly made of religion that traveled across time. And then in the Enlightenment, modernity came in, and slowly most of the people around the world, including those who were part of those ancient civilizations, India and China and Persia, they became part of modernity, but they did not accept or they did not practice the same type of modernity. They have different views because their cores are different. And some of these cores are related to religion, actually.
Let's pursue that in just a moment, but we'll take a short break.
With pleasure.
You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back again, Emanuel.
My pleasure.
Let's pursue this question of religion and the role of modernity. Actually, even before we get that, I'd like to ask, if there are multiple modernities, what is it that unites them all as species of the genus modernity?
It unites them in terms of the escape from traditionalism, from tradition. And it unites them in terms of trying to find a set of values and practices that are consonant with ideas that have developed since the Enlightenment, with technologies, with social technologies, with markets, and so on and so forth. But the interpretation, let's say, of democracy or of human rights that we take to be a modern phenomenon is different. They are not, though, traditional in the sense of what as we knew, let's say, civilizations, let's say back in the Middle Ages or even before Greece, Rome, and so on and so forth.
So in your view, it would be fair to say that some societies now are modern, some are pre-modern, or still traditional, largely, and some are now often referred to as postmodern. Some people say, for example, that Europe is a postmodern society.
Let me clarify that, or at least what I believe, and that is contested as well. I think they are all modern in some way, but they are differently modern. So it is because once you start to say, this is modern and this is more modern than the other, then you put yourself as the model and say, they are not like me. I'm the epitome of modernism, and the others have not reached yet, although they have they have a path to go before getting to be like me. That's a traditional way of looking at it. The other way is that they will never be like me, and perhaps I will never be like them. We are going to be modernly different. And so we are going to differ in the way we take and understand modernity. One of the examples is the approach that, especially in the last 10, 15 years, the West has vis-a-vis the Muslim world, vis-a-vis Islam. And the approach is, well, either it is pre-modern, they are not like us, but one day they should get like us, and they will get like us. And the notion that they are doing what they are doing, meaning 9/11 and the sort of the political fundamentalism that is now on the fore, has to do with a reaction against our modernity because they are pre-modern. And the other view is that this is not the case, that they are also modern, but they represent a very different type of modernity. And modernity is divided in, let's say, pragmatic view, type of modernities, or more, let's say, Jacobin type of modernities, in which are more revolutionary. And you can see those both within the West and in non-Western societies.
But what would divide the Western world from the Muslim world most fundamentally, in your view, according to your understanding of the large macro organization of social order in the world? Is it the role of religion?
Well, to some extent it is. Religion is involved in creating that divide, but I think it is in how the West actually was constituted by the Enlightenment, and then sort of, it's where science, markets, democracy, and what comes in terms of parliament, etc., developed sort of practices that the Western world developed since the modern era, since the Enlightenment, which actually the Muslim world did not. The Muslim world now is going through a modernization process, but it's not the same modernization process that we are going through, and thus the divide, thus the lack of understanding, also the lack of common knowledge between us, because we and they do not understand in the sense of they are rational, we are rational, but our rationalities are partly different, because we don't transmit in the same wavelength sometimes. Eisenstadt maintained that one of the main reasons for that was religion, that religion was at the core of that major disagreement across these things we call civilizations.
That is an interesting view, and it's a bit ironic because, right, in the Muslim world, some of the earliest advances in mathematics and science occurred. Absolutely. And in the Muslim world, markets were perfected long before they were perfected in the Western world.
True.
So there is a time difference for sure in the rates of development and the phases of development. But in your view, it's the role of religion as sort of continuously present in the public sphere in the Muslim world that fundamentally distinguishes its kind of modernity from, say, Western European modernity. That would be a core defining difference.
That's one, and that's sort of, I would say, it's very basic, but it is also out of that the type of practices, because I tend to see civilizations as communities of practice, and sort of the types of practices that civilizations developed. Going back to your earlier question, If Europe can be seen today as being postmodern, it's not postmodern in a philosophical sense. It is postmodern because the practices that has adopted, especially the EU, in the last 20 years or so, they transcend the power politics model, modern model, that we know since Westphalia. And they are beginning to try to transcend it. And in that sense, I think they are postmodern, not in any other sense. If I may add another thing, civilizations are pluralistic, and actually there is so much of, as you were rightly saying, about the Muslim world and their achievements. A great deal of what Europe became, it became because of the encounters with the Muslim world, and vice versa. So this is one of the, I think, the negative things that I see in the clash of civilizations, which completely disregards the interconnectedness and the multiplicity of encounters between civilizations. Europe and the Muslim world, it's a great example.
Fascinating. Well, we'll be right back with Emanuel Adler to talk about the structure of global order. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Let's get a little bit more specific about the clash between the so-called West and the so-called Muslim world, and talk a bit about the Middle East, which is one of your areas of specialty. Is what we like to think of as the Middle East problem a microcosm of this larger global clash of modernities that we've been speaking about so far? And if so, how does the specific local character of the nature of the issues and the nature of the peoples involved affect it?
Well, to a large extent it is, in the sense that you can see the different divides, that are that comes to the fore, especially when it comes to Israel vis-a-vis Muslim countries. Obviously, you have religious divisions between the Muslim world, Sunni and Shia, for example. But it is not only that. I mean, in the Middle East, if it's a microcosmos of everything, really. It is a microcosmos of the states and its foundations, of the weakness of states. It is about a microcosmos of war and peace. It's a microcosmos of human sort of the human condition, for better or worse, many times for worse. It is a microcosmos of intractable conflicts, although we know from history that there have been protracted conflicts and very long conflicts that lasted so far. I mean, that lasted more than so far the Middle East. And I could go on and on, even to other areas, thinking globally, which is a very good case, microcosmos of human rights and its violations, the environment and what is being done against the environment, and you name it. It is really a laboratory of what we were, because in some sense, some of the bitter conflicts of the Middle East now were created in the past, especially by Europe, in Europe, and we are now, in a sense, paying the price. And then the Europeans now come and say, they have moved, and now they come and say, oh, no, you need to be nice, you need to be nice to each other. We now have practices that if you adopt them, You can make peace to each other, but some of, if I may use the term, some of the mess really started, with colonialism and the way the Middle East was divided. But the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in particular, but Israelis and the Arab world more generally, not only represents some of what we were talking before about multiple modernities, but also involves not just as it usually perceives as a fight for territory, but really it's a question of claims about identity, mainly about identity, but also about dignity and respect. That goes to talk about the human condition. And this is why it's so difficult to resolve. I think that unless and until the two sides will not change their identities, it will be very, very difficult to find a real solution to the conflict. And by changing their identities, because one actually knows who they are because of the other. So their identities need to move from being conflictual, the way they see them as, it's either me or them, in the sense that it can be me and them. And this has been a process that actually started to occur, and even in recent months we got to understand that on both sides in different times there was good attitudes in order to try to achieve those, to get closer to each other, even at the level of identity. But the forces that run against them are so strong that there is an asymmetry between building together and destroying. And by asymmetry, I mean what takes years and years and great difficulty to build, it can be destroyed in a minute. And I'm alluding here to the spoiler problem.
Right.
You can...
Demolition is easier than construction.
Exactly.
We'll be back in just a minute again with Emanuel Adler. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Coming back once more to Middle East, but then broadening the discussion to global governance to try to bring this full circle. It's striking that if you're right, as I suspect you are, that the real issues in the Middle East the conflicts are identity conflicts. They're ideational conflicts and not merely material conflicts, the way we traditionally understand conflict in the so-called modern study of international politics. It's still striking that you could have said exactly the same thing about Europe in the early 20th century. And of course, we saw spectacular levels of bloodshed as a result of intra-European. So what enabled Europe, rather dramatically, all of a sudden, to make this shift from sort of the hotbed of ideational identity conflict to a postmodern, malleable, shared identity zone in which there are now, very strikingly, no expectations of violent conflict. And that hasn't happened in the Middle East.
In one word, catastrophe. There are two ways, in basic terms, to change identities. One is via learning. I can give you several examples. Civil rights in America, the end of the Cold War, the end of apartheid in South Africa. These are cases, and I'm talking about big violence, so in this sense, I'm calling them as changes of identities via learning processes. The alternative to change identities, to to changing big, in a big sense, is catastrophe. And this is what happened in World War II. This is what happened to Germany. This is what happened to France in particular. This is what happened, by the way, to Japan. And this is what happened to Europe. Catastrophe led Europe to be just shambles. I mean, its civilization collapsed. Everything that was, good about Europe, if I may broaden a little bit with matters of, from World War I to World War II, the Holocaust and colonialism, and the inability to actually solve the problems by themselves, led Europe to a point that it either had to assemble the pieces again and reinvent themselves, as they did, it's what you were talking about, or just disappear like others did in history, getting into sort of different pieces and parts, but not being what it used to be. It was the catastrophe. And then going back to the Middle East, and when I look now at the positions that are being taken by some Arab countries, by Israel, and the nuclear issue between Iran and Israel, and not only Israel, actually, between Iran and the West, etc.
Iran and its neighbors.
Iran and its neighbors, exactly. I think I see that double alternative. We either find some way via learning to change identities and actually not only make a sulha, as they call it in Arabic, not just sort of peaceful coexistence for a while, but we learn how to make peace by accepting the other, each other, or unfortunately it will be catastrophe, will produce the change. And I hope that it's the former and not the latter.
Now we think of global governance as a practice whose primary job, if it has any job at all, is to avoid catastrophe.
Right.
So given that we do not want to encourage the catastrophe option for change in the Middle East, what are we doing well in terms of global governance approaches to the Middle East? What are we doing badly? If you had a few words of advice to give the international community, the heads of mission at the United Nations and so forth, what would you say? What should they be doing different to cultivate the kind of learning that would result in a productive identity shift?
Well, I think first of all, and this is very, very controversial because it will speak to different people, and different people will take it to different places. But certainly, even-handed, especially when it comes to the UN, even-handed position. Because once you lose the even-handed, you lose the possibility that one of the side will be a partner of that identity change, because you need both partners to do it. You need stronger institutions. Because actually the institutions of global governance are not strong. There are some good practices actually, and during the Oslo process, some practices were brought from Europe, and which played an important role in bringing about the end of the Cold War. But the problem is that the Middle East is not Europe, and they just could not be transported. You cannot just take practices from one place to the other and say, so to give you a short answer, it is to adapt the practices to the particular cultures, to the context, including civilizational context, cultural context, historical context of the peoples where you want to try to change your identities, prevent war, and lead them into a peaceful solution.
Let's hope we find enough time to do that before the catastrophe option rears its head.
I share the hope with you, absolutely.
Thank you very much for coming, Emanuel. It's been delightful and informative.
My pleasure, really.
Please join us again next week on Inside the Issues, and look for us meantime, anytime, at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter and on YouTube.